Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Happy Wednesday. We have attendees continuing to trickle in, and so we are very grateful to have you all with us. We're also aware that the vice presidential debates are on this evening, so it's a busy week of events, but we appreciate you being here with us. Also note that tonight's presentation with Dr. Sleeder is being recorded as well, and that will be posted to our website, so that will be accessible for our community. My name is Roddy Boonchoy, Associate Superintendent of Instructional Services, and we are excited and eager to re-engage the important work of planning for ethnic studies in DJUSD. As many of you know, we began this work last January, which of course was paused by COVID and the subsequent school closures. But we're ready to pick up where we left off, and we will begin that work with a very special guest, Dr. Christine Sleeder, to ground us in the values and impact of ethnic studies programming. Some of you joining this webinar participated on the DJUSD Ethnic Studies Task Force in the spring, where we came together as a community to build a vision for our students that reflects their diversity, identities, cultures, and lived experiences. And this was and continues to be important because this work aligns to our district goal of closing the opportunity gap, meaning the opportunity for all of our students to see themselves reflected in the curriculum and their school experience. And this is part of our effort to confront disproportionate levels of engagement and achievement of many students, particularly our students of color, and to address limited racial awareness for all of our students. This is all even more pronounced by the fact that we are navigating a global pandemic. We've upended the traditional paradigm of public education in this era of COVID, and importantly, amid a broader social and political awakening to issues of systemic racism and social justice following the death of George Floyd back in May. So tonight we bring to Davis, virtually of course, Dr. Christine Sleeder to help orient us to ethnic studies, what it is and its impact. And next week on Thursday, October 15th at 6:30 p.m. is the DJUSD Board of Education meeting, where we will outline our plan to bring our stakeholders together to move our ethnic studies planning forward. So we ask that you tune in then for details regarding the work of the district. Tonight's webinar is dedicated to Dr. Sleeder and an overview of ethnic studies. She will present for roughly an hour, and then the remaining 20 minutes or so will be a question and answer session for her. We are using the webinar feature of Zoom, which has an option for you to send questions you might have for Dr. Sleeder about ethnic studies. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see an icon that says Q&A. And for any questions that you have for Dr. Sleeder, anytime during the presentation, go ahead and add them there. I'll track those questions posted during the presentation and then bring them to Dr. Sleeder during the Q&A following her presentation as time allows. Again, questions should be about ethnic studies that our guest expert can field. Anything related to district plans and processes will be discussed at next week's board meeting. This webinar is being recorded, as I mentioned, so that it'll be available for members of our community who are unable to attend tonight. If you were not on last year's task force and would like to participate in the work of the district, please visit our Ethnic Studies webpage on the DJUSD website, and there is a form for you to sign up. If you signed up last year, you are still on that list, and you will still continue to receive communications about our work. With that, let's have some welcoming words from our superintendent, Dr. John Bose, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Christine Sleeder.
Thank you, Roddy. And let me begin by welcoming everyone online with us this evening. I hope you and your families have been well, and we are thrilled to be able to continue our work to develop an ethnic studies program here in the Davis Joint Unified School District. Work has been underway on developing our ethnic studies programming for over 2 years, and we've been following the series of state legislative efforts and the development of a draft model curriculum for ethnic studies, as well as having begun our own work to build foundational knowledge and the relationships we need to thoughtfully begin this effort via the DJUSD Ethnic Studies Task Force. Back in the spring of 2019, we heard the voices of our community advocating for ethnic studies. And at the heart of this work, our values are aligned in that we believe it's important to offer educational experiences that are relevant, diverse, and affirming of student identities. Our approach and philosophy for any major program development and how it fits into the broader context of history, law, policy, and pedagogy, and also rooted in our commitment to our graduate profile and to our DJUSD board resolution that in Davis, everyone belongs in our community, is foundational to our work around ethnic studies. Just as with our career technical education and distance learning efforts, our work must be intentional and inclusive so that we create a meaningful outcome and ensure that that outcome is sustainable. Ethnic studies in Davis Joint Unified is not a matter of if, but when. While COVID-19 has turned our world upside down in so many ways, we're proud to be maintaining a continued focus on developing our ethnic studies programming in Davis Joint Unified. I'm very excited about this work. Let me extend a warm welcome to Dr. Sleeder on behalf of the Davis Joint Unified School District Board of Education, and I'll turn this back over to Associate Superintendent Boonchoi. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bose. And let me introduce Dr. Christine Sleeder. Dr. Sleeder is a professor emerita in the College of Education at California State University, Monterey Bay, where she was a founding faculty member. She is past president of the National Association for Multicultural Education and past vice president of the American Educational Research Association. Her research focuses on anti-racist, multicultural education, ethnic studies, and teacher education. She has published over 150 articles and 24 books, including Unstandardizing Curriculum with Judith Flores Carmona, Transformative Ethnic Studies in Schools with Miguel Zavala, and 2 novels related to ethnic studies. She is a fellow of the American Educational Research Association and a member of the National Academy of Education. Awards for her work include the American Educational Research Association Social Justice and Education Award and the Chapman University Paulo Freire Education Project Social Justice Award. With that, we are honored, privileged, and grateful for Dr. Sleeder to join us, and we look forward to her presentation. Dr. Sleeder.
Okay. Thank you very much for that warm introduction. I'm very pleased to be with all of you this evening. I would like to begin with a brief land acknowledgement. I live and work in Monterey, Pacific Grove, which is the homeland of the Esalen people and the Rumsen Ohlone people. I'm grateful for the people of this land for allowing me the space to do the work that I do. In my talk this evening, I will first talk a little bit about the relationship between ethnic studies and multicultural education and what happened to multicultural education, why ethnic studies now. Then offer a brief working definition of ethnic studies and what it's for. Look at the research on the impact of ethnic studies on students, and then spend some time with curriculum, with some examples of curriculum and what teachers grapple with as they're working with ethnic studies curriculum. So let me shift to screen sharing. Let's see. Yeah, okay. I'm going to be talking partly from these 2 books here, Ethnic Studies and Transformative Ethnic Studies in Schools that I co-authored with Miguel Zavala, and Rethinking Ethnic Studies that I co-edited that's been published by Rethinking Schools. Why ethnic studies now? Let me go back briefly to the late 1960s, which is when ethnic studies and multicultural education began. They have roots that go back farther than that, but I'm going to go back to about 1968. And the movements of the 1960s and early 1970s that gave rise to multicultural education and ethnic studies. These were social movements that were pushing back against decades and centuries of oppression and exclusion and attempts by peoples who had been locked out of the system to change the system to make it more inclusive. And it was out of the ferment of this time that both ethnic studies and multicultural education came. In 1968, San Francisco State University, the Third World Liberation Front strike was for ethnic studies. And the same year, let me move something on my screen that's getting a little bit in the way here. Sorry about that. The Chicano student movement in Los Angeles that was also pushing for ethnic studies in the high schools. The terms down here, free of territory and free of consciousness, with both of these refer to the idea that ethnic studies was attempting to free people from the oppressive conditions in which people were living, which included control over land, control over labor, control over the conditions of people's lives, as well as free the consciousness that people have about why their lives are the way they are. During the same context, schools were in the process of being desegregated, unwillingly in many parts of the country. A lot of the desegregation involved the closing of African-American schools and the firing of African-American teachers and administrators. And then African-American students were sent to predominantly white schools, or that had been all white schools that in many cases really didn't want them. And in that context, Black parents and educators noticed several very pressing problems that they began to speak out about. One of them was the biased assumptions and low academic expectations on the part of white teachers for African-American kids. African-American kids were routinely referred for special education. There were classes, this is true, classes for the so-called culturally deprived, and they would be put in those classes for slow learners. So that was a problem. The all-white curriculum was a problem. The textbooks during the late 1960s and early 70s didn't acknowledge people of color at all. And even though in the Black schools they'd been using white textbooks, there was a lot of knowledge in the Black schools about Black history, Black thinking, Black literature that the teachers could incorporate, but not in the white schools. Another problem was the lack of school community connection. In the segregated schools, the community was part of the school and the school was part of the community. But with desegregation, that linkage, in most cases, was broken. The teachers lived in communities that were different from the communities that the Black students lived in, and there weren't those school community relations. So concern about these and other things became really the foundation for multicultural education. This slide shows one of the first documents that was written about multicultural education. It kind of lays out what people were talking about wanting in terms of school transformation. And when I've gone back to read it, it's actually more radical than you would think, something that was written in the early 1970s called Multicultural Education might be. At the time, 1972, I was just beginning to be a teacher in Seattle public schools. I had grown up in Medford, Oregon, had an all-white education. And through, I'm not going to tell the whole story of how I wound up being prepared for urban schools and then was teaching in Seattle. But I found myself in a cultural context that I didn't have the background for. And so I spent a lot of time kind of immersing myself in the Black community particularly, and doing a whole lot of reading to try to educate myself for the reality where I was living. The work that happened during the 1970s, or late 1960s and 1970s, had a quite measurable impact on student learning. This is a diagram that shows reading scores from the National assessment of education progress for 17-year-old students from 1971 to 1990. The black and white line at the top represents white students, the red line represents African-American students, and the green line represents Latino students. And what you can see is over the almost 20-year period here, white student achievement was staying pretty flat, but black student achievement and Latino student achievement was on an upward trajectory, not just because of multicultural education and ethnic studies. There was a lot that was going on: school desegregation, the war on poverty, bilingual education, a lot of things happening, but those things were translating out into improved student learning. From the 1990s onward, the picture has not been the same. Now this diagram only goes up to 2008, but as I've looked at diagrams that have gone another 10 years, it's sort of more of the same, of fairly flat learning trajectories for white students, and for students of color, an achievement gap that still remains with fluctuations. What happened to multicultural education, and why has multicultural education become something that is in many ways, I think, has turned into something that for many students feels disempowering if they experience it at all? I think there are four main factors that happened. One has to do with white teacher rearticulations of what multicultural education means. As schools were desegregated and black teachers were fired, we had a predominantly white teaching force that needed a lot of professional development. And I remember in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when I'd gone to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and my mentor, Carl Grant, who is African-American, was doing workshops in schools for teachers. And so he would bring his graduate students along as a way of training us to also do the same kind of workshops he was doing. And I remember, I distinctly remember an instance where he was doing a workshop, and at the end of it, and we were debriefing, and he said, "You noticed that I didn't use the word racism or race?" And I said, "Yeah, I noticed." "Why?" And he said, "Because you have this group of white women, and if I, as an African-American, start talking about race and racism, they're out of here. They're not going to listen to me. Either they'll close their ears or they're just plain gone." And this was, I think, typical of what happened with a lot of training of white teachers, of it's framed ways that white people would listen. But in the process, white people started re-articulating what multicultural education meant. And I've highlighted some things here: expanding students' awareness, learning to get along, learning to be colorblind. One teacher in a study I was doing once described multicultural education as spreading the pixie dust. And I'm like, wow, all the way from challenging racism to down to spreading the pixie dust. But I think that's had a profound impact on how multicultural education has been interpreted within schools. A second factor was a conservative campaign, which here I've called a war against multicultural education, that was orchestrated by conservative groups who put a lot of money into think tanks that then produced books, magazine articles, op-eds about everything that was wrong with multicultural education, as a way of trying to convince the public that this was a terrible idea. And I remember some of the things that I would read would talk about these Marxists in the university who are foisting stuff on communities of color. And I'm, it's like, I've heard that stuff like really recently, so we're doing it all again. A third issue that transformed multicultural education in ways that I think weren't helpful was neoliberalism, which beginning in the late 1980s, early 1990s, became the predominant economic philosophy in the US as well as many other places in the world, organized around the principles of free markets, privatization, and education, it started out with standardizing the curriculum and using accountability to make sure everybody was learning in what the curriculum said, which would be the testing program. But at the same time, and so multicultural education really got shoved aside, but at the same time, the US population was becoming increasingly diverse. So I picked here one of Time magazine's cover stories about the changing face of America. Time had more than one. Another one about the browning of America, because people couldn't just say, we're just gonna totally ignore the diversification of the population. And so multiculturalism took on this kind of soft, get along way of thinking about it. And in education, in many of the standards documents, this took the form of kind of sprinkling in the words multicultural or culturally relevant pedagogy or that kind of thing. I recall not too long ago reviewing some education standards documents in the state of New Mexico and noticing that the term culturally relevant pedagogy appeared quite a lot in this one document, but it was never defined, never elaborated on. But people could say, well, you know, we're dealing with our diversity, but not really. And then a fourth issue that's kind of related to that had to do with textbooks. I mentioned that textbooks were all white when the schools were desegregated, and that became a real huge flashpoint. Publishers began having meetings with, I've gone to actually a lot of these during about the 1980s, meetings with textbook publishers trying to figure out how to make the textbooks more diverse. This slide shows an analysis of textbooks that I and some graduate students did of 10 social studies texts and 10 reading language arts texts. And what we did was go through and count the numbers and both pictures and names that were in the textbooks of Latinos, whites, American Indians, African Americans, and Asian Americans. And so you'll have like 0 to 4%, means of the 10 textbooks, 0 to 4% of the pictures or references to people were Latino. And I juxtapose this against the student demographics in the US and the teacher demographics in the US. And what this shows is that if you're a white kid, and there is no racial ethnic majority anymore, as you know, in the K-12 schools in the US. But if you're a white kid, your chances of having teachers who look like you are, I mean, like 84%. And your textbooks will also usually reflect people who look like you in the majority. If you're African American, the most work with textbooks has been done with African Americans, integrating African Americans into the text. If you're African American, you'll see people who look like you in the text. May or may not have a teacher who looks like you, but the texts are still going to be framed from white points of view. If you're Latino, American Indian, or Asian American, you may not see yourself much at all in the textbooks or in the teaching force. And it matters a lot. This slide shows, for instance, if you were taking a course on US history from a Mexican American perspective, the kinds of topics that would be in the course. Now I want to contrast this with what gets selected out of here and dropped into the textbooks. We have some topics here that are in very short form will get dropped into the textbooks. But what isn't here is also very important. The whole idea of colonization and conquest gets taken out. The idea of collective action on the part of Mexican Americans to push back against marginalization gets taken out. And really here it gets reduced like to Cesar Chavez. The intellectual work of people of Mexican descent and of Latinos, of Mexican Americans gets reduced to cultural contributions. I've done a similar analysis of African Americans, and it's the same, really the same pattern. And students notice this. There's a lot of research that looks at, people have interviewed students and particularly students of color, not too much research interviewing white students, about how they see the curriculum. And as students go through school, especially the older they get, the more they see discrepancies between what they're taught in school and what they learn in the community. And so, like, I'll just read one of these. In the interest of time, this Black high school student says, it's basically what you need to know to graduate, like the real history of the world, just like what your teacher thinks is important. I know that a lot of our history, like Black women and things we did as maybe civil rights leaders in history, is missing. It's what you're supposed to know to get through the system, to graduate, just to keep your teachers or the testers happy. Kids of color. And there are now, over the last 10 years, I would say, quite a number of studies who are looking at how kids see school and the curriculum, find themselves in a position of, do you learn to distrust school? And that's what I'm seeing coming through in these interviews. I've talked with a number of students of color coming into CSU Monterey Bay, and I for a while directed the Master of Arts in Education program there. And I remember a number of stories by students of color who, when they would apply to be in the program, I'd ask them, why do you want your master's degree? And would tell me stories about how disinterested they became in school, going through school. And it was when they found an ethnic studies class that spoke to them that they started seeing the relevance of education. So this leads me to what ethnic studies is for, and kind of a working definition of ethnic studies. These are hallmarks of ethnic studies that Miguel Zavala and I write about in our book, Transformative Ethnic Studies in Schools. And I'm not going to read them all, but instead I'm going to kind of synthesize them into three main areas that ethnic studies really tries to address. And this is like, why ethnic studies? One of them is the academic achievement and engagement of students of color. And when I get to showing the research in a few minutes, you'll see that ethnic studies makes a marked impact on the achievement and engagement of students of color. But very often, teachers will think that students bring disinterest in school from home. And I've had so many people over the years tell me that, well, their parents don't care about education, so therefore they don't either. Well, it's what we're offering kids in school that turns a lot of students off. And so ethnic studies bring students in to the academic learning by making education relevant to the students. A second reason why ethnic studies and problem ethnic studies tries to address is the relevance of education to solving problems of communities of color. One of the reasons why the movement for ethnic studies was organized back in the 1960s was the irrelevance of university education to the problems that communities of color were facing. And if you just think about an issue today, for example, COVID-19, why are there disproportionate deaths in communities of color? Now, what ethnic studies doesn't recommend doing is you develop a lesson about that, hand students the answer, and then go on to something else. Instead, it's how does the community define what the problem is? What are the roots of the problem? What are the analytical frameworks that come from people from this community that can help shed light on the problem? Who do we gather data from that would help us understand the problem? And how can we go about addressing the problem? A third area that ethnic studies is important for is helping youth as future citizens learn to engage across differences to address problems that we face. And this would include like white students being able to understand where students of color are coming from, to be able to have intelligent dialogues about issues around race. And this is something that this country has. Every once, things happen and they'll say, we need to have a discussion about race. We need to have a national dialogue about race. And that falls flat. And it's mostly because white people aren't used to having dialogues about race. And ethnic studies tries to involve people in that process. So what does the research say about the track record of ethnic studies as meeting these three goals? There's not so much research on the relevance of education to solving problems in communities of color. There are actually a lot of wonderful portraits of what can be done, but there's a lot of research on academic achievement and cross-group interaction. So in 2010, I was asked by the NEA to review the research on the impact of ethnic studies on students. And then, and that came out in 2011 through the NEA in a monograph. I updated that research in Transformative Multicultural or Transformative Ethnic Studies in Schools. When I sat down to do the research review, I had like studies all over my desk. And I ended up dividing them into two piles. One pile that focused on research on the impact of ethnic studies on students of color, and the other pile that focused on research on the impact of ethnic studies on diverse student groups that include white students. So, what is the impact of an ethnic studies curriculum on student achievement? This slide and this next slide show the studies that I've reviewed. All of them are in blue except one. The one that's kind of the salmon colored was the only one that did not find a positive impact of ethnic studies. All of the rest of them did. I'm not going to read through everything on the slide here, but you can see different programs like San Francisco Unified, Tucson, Math in a Cultural Context. I'll mention each of those briefly in a bit. The kind of research that was done, the outcomes that were looked at, but all except one found a positive impact on students' academic achievement. And the one that didn't, the main problem, this is in Oakland, was that the middle-class African-American community that came up with an Afrocentric design for the curriculum, that design clashed with the students' understanding, Black students' understanding of who they were as growing up in high poverty neighborhoods. It could have been bridgeable, but in the way it played out, it ended up not working that way. These studies looked at ethnic studies curriculum plus asset-based pedagogy. And these were studies where the curriculum was important, but how teachers were leveraging the cultural resources that students bring was really what was being looked at. For example, Carol Lee's work in cultural modeling is a program where she was working with African-American students in high poverty African-American schools. In the Chicago area around learning how to do literature analysis. And she realized that by starting with, instead of starting literature analysis with texts in the textbook, she would start with cultural forms that the African-American students were familiar with, like music videos, or films that they were watching, and do literary analysis of what the kids were familiar with, and then gradually move to less familiar literature. And then the third area is ethnic studies curriculum, how it impacts on student identity and student sense of self. And again, you can see the outcomes and the way the studies were done. All but one of the studies found a positive impact. The one that didn't was a follow-up study to another study here, and I'm not real sure why the second time around they didn't find a positive impact, but they didn't. But all taken together, this is, I think, about 29 studies that found all but 2 a positive impact of ethnic studies on students of color. Now, as it relates to diverse student populations that include white students, most of the research has been done at the university level, and most has been looking at cross-racial attitudes and perspectives. And it's like a lot of studies. So this is just highlights of this research. Ethnic studies and women's studies courses usually have a positive impact on students' attitudes about race. And this is particularly among white students. Students of color have often already learned this stuff. But white students, for many of them, it's the first time that they've encountered an analysis of systemic racism. And it gives a whole different perspective of understanding what they see in the world around them. If cross-group interaction is part of the coursework, that strengthens the positive impact. And that kind of gets at the learning how to dialogue across lines of difference. The impact of all of this is greater on white students than students of color. although white students often struggle initially because it's very challenging to the ways that white students have grown up seeing things. But if white students stick with it, and there's been some research looking if white students take more than one course, then the learning trajectory goes up. And then instruction taking students' actual questions into account is more powerful than instruction that doesn't. And some of this research actually comes from looking at the early childhood level. But speaking as somebody who has worked with this principle a lot at the higher ed level, I can tell you it definitely makes a lot of sense. So let's take a look at curriculum. I know that across California, including in Davis, you're working with what's going to go in a 9th grade ethnic studies course. And I'll get to that. But I first want to talk a little bit about the broader curriculum, because a lot of the conflicts around ethnic studies have to do with what should we put into this one course. And I'm like, hey, there's K through 12 across the subject areas. Let's look expansively at the curriculum. For example, Tucson, their social justice education project that ran for about 8 years involved 4 courses in 4 high schools. The 2 history courses, a government course, and a literature course. And the teachers took the state standards for those courses, and then instead of teaching them through white intellectual frameworks, taught them through Chicano intellectual frameworks and Chicano intellectual knowledge, but it was still aligned to the standards. The teachers also made the courses college prep, even though most of the students coming into the courses, nobody had thought of as college prep at all. The research that was done on the impact of this program basically found that the students who took the Mexican American courses, when they came in scoring lower than the comparison group on the Ames tests, were the state reading, writing, and math achievement tests. But the students in the Mexican American classes, by the time they finished, were scoring higher than the comparison group. And the more of the 4 Mexican American courses that the students took, the more the achievement went up. A related example is from Missouri. I was looking for, as Miguel and I were working on transformative ethnic studies in schools, I wanted to find a good example of Black studies being taught in schools. So I asked a colleague, LaGarrett King at the University of Missouri. He runs the Center for Teaching Black History in schools, and he knows probably more about teaching Black history than anybody else I know. He's developed this Black curriculum framework for how Black history should be framed. And I've heard him say several times that what white people think is relevant to Black history isn't what Black people think is relevant to Black history. So I asked him who he would recommend that we look at as an example of somebody who's doing a really good job with Black history. And so he gave me the name of a high school teacher who he'd been working with. And that high school teacher, it turned out, was also working with a literature teacher. So he was teaching, Greg, the history teacher, was teaching history, and then the literature teacher, Molly. Both of them were white, which was interesting, which is a good illustration that white people can learn to teach ethnic studies well. It takes work, and it took a lot of work on themselves in addition to learning the content, but they can learn to do it well. I interviewed both of them and got their syllabi, and I'd met the history teacher to find out what they were doing. And this is just a synopsis that's from the book Transformative Ethnic Studies in Schools. But with their courses, they made the courses college prep, and they made them dual enrollment with community colleges. At the time, they were also trying to work out one as dual enrollment with the University of Missouri. And then the students these are mostly African-American students in their courses. About a third of the students in the school are African-American, but it was mostly African-American students who came to these courses. And they, the students had been like under-taught academically pretty much while they were going through school. So putting them in a course with the demands of an upper track AP courses, they had to do a lot of scaffolding to help the students learn the skills to be able to function at that level, which is the same issue in the Tucson Mexican-American courses. The content is very richly designed around African-American knowledge. And so the students are getting immersed in something that's academically demanding, with frameworks and perspectives that resonate with their life experience in their community. In this case, being taught by a white guy and a white woman who both are able to just stand up and explain why I am a white person, teaching this course and how this is going to work, and you can trust me or not trust me, but here's who I am. As a result, you see at the bottom of the slide, a couple of years ago, 30 out of their 40 students, all but 2 of whom were African-American, went on to college, which was a much higher college going rate than the school normally had. Just one more subject area that I'll briefly mention and then go to the ethnic studies course. This Math in a Cultural Context is a program that was developed in near Fairbanks, Alaska, to address the problem that elementary Yupik Indian kids were really struggling with math. And some anthropologists who are working with the school district noticed that mathematical thinking is used quite a bit within the Yupik community. But the way that mathematical thinking took form in the Yupik community and the way math is encoded in the classroom were all kind of like 2 different languages. So the anthropologists brought together math teachers and Yupik community members to develop a math curriculum that was oriented around both the NCTM standards and Yupik cultural knowledge. And so this is an example of one of the modules, building a fish rank. And so you can see what the math content was from the NCTM math standards, and then what the Yupik cultural content was, that then these are put together for teaching math. And one of the academic achievement studies that I cited earlier was a study of this project, which has also found that the kids were learning math better when it was taught in a culturally relevant way. So math and science we can work with, as well as history and social science and literature, which is where people usually start. Okay, what about the ethnic studies course? There are different ways that an ethnic studies course gets put together. The model curriculum that the state will be sharing has a lot of examples, but the one that I think is, that I personally think is the most interestingly put together is the one that San Francisco Unified has done. And they've been working with this now for almost 15 years, so they have quite a bit of experience under their belt. About 15 years ago, when the school district authorized the development of an ethnic studies course, a small number of teachers started meeting together, and they got some funding so that they would get paid for this over the summer to hash out what the course should look like. And one of my friends, a colleague from San Francisco State University, Alison Tintiago Cabales, I was talking to her on the phone once early in this process, and she was sort of almost tearing her hair out, because she said that a problem, and I think that this is the common problem, is that there were teachers who had ethnic studies backgrounds and teachers who didn't have ethnic studies background, but thought they understood ethnic studies better than they did, trying to work together to figure out what ethnic studies would look like. And there was a lot of kind of cross-dialogue, miscommunication, and issues. And I think it was helpful having Allison from the university there as a resource, because she was able to bring in knowledge and a perspective that people working in the schools didn't always necessarily have. And I really encourage people when they're thinking about developing ethnic studies, to identify who in ethnic studies in the local university or community college might be good to partner with. And that was one of the things that was really helpful for San Francisco Unified. But they did manage to hash out a way of getting started. They started small. They started with 5 pilot schools. The first iteration of the curriculum went group by group. So a couple weeks about Mexican Americans, a couple weeks about African Americans, a couple weeks about Filipinos, a couple weeks, and that didn't work very well. San Francisco is so diverse, and they couldn't cover everybody, and they couldn't cover anybody very well when they were doing it that way. So they decided to think about what were the cross-cutting themes that run through all of the different groups' experiences. And they came up with these 6 themes, which when I first saw this, I was like, this is really interesting to me, because a number of years ago, when I was on sabbatical, I was trying to figure out what are the key themes that run across the ethnic studies literature that differentiate it from like a weak multicultural curriculum. And I came up with almost the same themes. I don't think they were reading my work when they came up with these themes. I think we were both reading the same things, and these are the themes that emerged. But identity and narrative to begin with. And by the way, most ethnic studies courses do begin with identity, having the students think about who they are in relationship to ethnic studies, and having the students reclaim identities that have in many ways been squashed by mainstream institutions. And then think about what narratives students have been exposed to and how narratives shape how you think. Systems and power, hegemony and counter-hegemony, which have to do with domination and how we take domination for granted or not. Humanization and dehumanization, causality and agency, and transformation and change. Yeah. They have, they don't use a textbook. They have developed on a Google Drive folders for each one of these themes. And within the folders are like boatloads of teaching resources. When teachers are going to be teaching ethnic studies in San Francisco, before you can teach, you have to go through professional development. And they have a teacher on assignment whose job is to work with teachers learning to teach ethnic studies, who will take them through this professional development. And in the professional development, they learn both what ethnic studies is, what these themes mean, something about translating these themes into work with kids, and then how to use the various resources that are in the folders. And they also learn how to, and are really strongly encouraged to co-construct with their students some of the curriculum so that it's relevant to the students in their class and the communities that students come from. The authors, the two of the lead people, oh, wait a minute. Why is this not moving? Okay, two of the lead people, Kyle Beckham and Art Nelson Concordia, have written in Rethinking Ethnic Studies. At its core, ethnic studies reconstructs a more robust historical narrative that centers the teaching and learning on the perspectives of historically marginalized communities, specifically communities of color. They also write that ethnic studies is all of us. And ethnic studies, it's, and this is where it takes work for teachers to learn how to do this, of how do you situate white people, for instance, in narratives that are narratives specifically from communities of color, because by ethnic studies being all of us, it doesn't mean that non-communities of color are going to suddenly start taking over the narratives. That's actually what happened a lot with multicultural education. But it means learning how to speak with and include all of us within narratives that come from communities of color. They point out that ethnic studies looks different in different places because communities and kids are different. And they emphasize that ethnic studies teachers are made and not born. They put a lot of work into teacher professional development and say that if you don't have good teacher professional development, you're not probably going to have very good ethnic studies. But teacher professional development can make people who are like, I don't know what to do, turn into good ethnic studies teachers. A related framework is one that I helped work on. The ethnic studies macro scales. Tolteca Cuatin and from Southern California is probably the main person who's conceptualized these 4 areas, which are very similar to the San Francisco areas. I think the first one is the most different, Indigeneity and Roots, which starts with the idea of the sovereignty of the indigenous peoples in the US, in the locality, who still maintain relations with their ancestral knowledge and kind of start the conversation there. And in addition, start the conversation also with whatever indigeneity anybody brings, because everybody has roots that are indigenous to some place. It might not be to here, but it's to some place. And then that gets us into looking at our identity. A couple of teachers I've talked with, including the lead ethnic studies teacher in Salinas, who's now a teacher on assignment working with the ethnic studies teachers. When they ran into this conceptualization, it was like, oh man, is that ever helpful? Mark from Salinas was telling me that he had all these different lessons that he was teaching, and he was able to take what he called these 4 buckets, put his lessons into the buckets, and then the curriculum had a cohesion that it hadn't had before. So any of you who are interested in seeing more how that plays out, Rethinking Ethnic Studies is organized around these 4 areas. And each one of the areas, one of the sections in the book, has about 8 or 10 chapters that are mostly written by and for classroom teachers that include activities and help for learning to teach, you know, for working with the ideas within that particular bucket. At the preschool level, there's also work being done in ethnic studies. I'll share with you one example. Oakland Unified School District has teachers in the early childhood level who a few years ago started coming together to try to figure out what ethnic studies would look like at the early childhood level. And they spent about 2 years hashing out a framework that would guide their work as ethnic studies teachers at the preschool level, preschool and early childhood level. These ideas here: critique dominant individuals, institutions, ideologies, divert needed resources to the community, ensure needs of the community are met, incorporate multidisciplinary, holistic methods, series, models, perspectives, and approaches, foster reflexivity and negotiate outsiderness, insiderness, celebrate communal and individual assets, and build community and promote healing. They spent a lot of time themselves agreeing upon these principles. And then these principles then formed the basis for the various units that they've developed and worked with in their classrooms. One of the teachers from Oakland who's worked with this group in Transformative Ethnic Studies in Schools there's a section on her and what she does with this at the transitional kindergarten level. So I want to kind of, I guess, close with some words from ethnic studies teachers that get at some things that are central to at least starting to think about teaching and learning to teach ethnic studies. One that has come through a lot in discussions with teachers is identity. In Transformative Ethnic Studies in Schools, Miguel Zavala and I interviewed 9 ethnic studies teachers about their work and wanted to find out from them what they saw as core to their work and that they thought would be useful to other teachers knowing. And the one that really bubbled up to the top was the importance of identity, awareness of how identity shapes the self of both the teachers and the students and the social relations in the classroom. Identity is a resource, identity is shaped through their teaching, identity is negotiated in relation to the students. And anybody who's an ethnic studies teacher, regardless of whether they're white or a person of color, needs to spend time figuring out how you situate yourself within the field of ethnic studies in relationship to the community that you're working with, in relationship to the students that you're working with, and how that identity then shapes the work that you do. And for all of us in ethnic studies, this identity work is super, super important. As one teacher was explaining to me, your identity is what you bring into the classroom almost before you bring in anything else. And it shapes everything else that's going to happen. So understanding that identity is really important. There isn't like good or bad ethnic identity for teaching ethnic studies. Anybody can learn to teach ethnic studies, but doing this identity work is super important. The teachers then talked about the importance of learning how to do those were things that they struggled with. How to teach difficult histories in nuanced ways. Like if you're teaching about colonization, you're teaching about genocide, how do you grapple with those histories in ways that students can take in, and so there isn't like one answer for learning how to do that. Teachers would talk about the importance of having support groups or other teachers they could talk with to figure out how to do this. How to scaffold complex concepts related to racism and oppression. And there's increasingly help for teachers. We tried to, in putting together Rethinking Ethnic Studies, we tried to put into that book a lot of resources that teachers could use that would do exactly this, of helping to scaffold complex concepts related to racism and oppression. But then learning how to use those tools and use them with kids takes some practice. And then the last one that bubbled up as a big one was maintaining integrity and criticality, given the white master narrative that all of us have learned. And what that essentially means is we've all gone through the same school system that is driven primarily by a white master narrative. And that narrative, it's sort of what we grew up with, what all of us grew up with, what all of us are familiar with. And we'll push back both in terms of what I know and what I don't know, in terms of how other people see what I'm doing or start pushing back against what I'm doing, and how do you maintain the integrity of what ethnic studies is trying to do in a context in which there is going to be pushback that comes from the white master narrative. I think these are things that can lead to figuring out ways of putting together support groups for teachers that can help teachers grapple with these real issues as teachers are learning to do the very important work of ethnic studies. But I'm so glad that you're embarking on doing this, and I would be very happy to help out in whatever way I can. And if any of you would like a copy of the slides that I've used this evening, I'd be happy to share those.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sleeder. I don't know if you can hear it, but there's a round of virtual applause in our community right now for your presentation. You covered a lot of material and addressed a lot of very complex issues that we have been working through as a community earlier on with our Ethnic Studies Task Force. So a lot of these issues are directly relevant to many of our conversations. We have about 30 minutes, and we have quite a few questions that have come in. And so I'm going to prompt you with some of them, and then we'll wrap up at around 7. Sound good?
Yep.
Okay. And the first one question that's technical in nature is around this recording and your PowerPoint. So we will be posting these resources and the recording to our Ethnic Studies webpage as soon as we get it downloaded. That way it's accessible to our community, our stakeholders, and everyone to follow up on. So here's a question that came up that was a theme in many questions actually, and simply, how do we get buy-in from white parents in a predominantly white community, particularly in this political environment? And I'm going to add a second question into that, and that is, how do we help our families of color feel invited in that context?
When I'm talking with white parents, what I try to emphasize is that their kids are growing up in a diverse society. It is a diverse society. And the kids can see issues and problems that in many cases they just simply don't understand. And my experience with the kids is that often they actually want to know more than they know about the world that they see around them, but are afraid to ask. Young students that I've worked with at the university, like at the freshman and sophomore level, who are just coming out of high school, have kind of learned things like that it's impolite to ask questions related to race and racism, or actually any form of difference, and have learned to do a lot of self-censorship of themselves because they're afraid that they're going to say something that will be offensive. And it's not that they don't want to learn, but it's that they're afraid to get into the discussions because they're afraid they just don't know where it's going to go. What ethnic studies should be doing, and this is why I really think I would love to see people starting at the early childhood level and going all the way through, is building the capacity for us to understand where each other's coming from and to be able to have conversations, not conversations that are based on ignorance, but conversations that are based on knowledge. In my own classes, I've taught classes, some of them are all white, some of them are classes in which, a couple of classes that were all students of color, and then many classes that were just mixed. But what I'd be trying to get to in my classes is for students to be able to hear where someone else is coming from, and especially around difficult issues. And it is possible to learn how to do that. Sometimes things can get contentious, although also in my experience, kids can deal with the contention easier than adults can deal with the contention. But for white parents, well, again, using myself as an example, I grew up in an all-white community and found myself teaching in an environment where it was just totally different from where I'd grown up. And I felt so stupid, so just unprepared, stupid. And if I could go back and have had a community that was preparing me in a constructive way for living and working in a diverse society, I would have actually been way better prepared as a teacher than I was. So that's when I'm talking with white parents, that's kind of how I phrase it. Now, how to make communities of color or parents of color feel invited? Have parents and been invited into the conversations around ethnic studies? And I'm just asking you, because inviting people to come into the table to try to help make decisions about the curriculum and about how all of this is going to work, I think is crucially important. And in addition, well, it's sort of hard to do this with COVID where we're all at home kind of, talking through Zoom, but I also believe in taking the work out into the community. When I was working with teacher education at the university level, I realized that when I moved myself and my project away from the university out into the community, and I started working through community centers, I got a lot more engagement with communities of color than when I was trying to do it all on my turf. So I think partnerships with community centers, and I don't know Davis at all, but I know that like when I was in Wisconsin, I was working with the Urban League of Racine and the Urban League of Kenosha, tutoring center in Racine, rec centers, but that would get me out into the community, and it made a huge difference in terms of who was participating.
Thank you, Dr. Sleeder. Next question. There is resistance and critique to the focus on the 4 groups: African American, American Indian, Asian Americans, Latinx, and ethnic studies. How would you answer that critique?
Well, these are 4 groups that have been marginalized in the curriculum for like ever. Maybe not the only groups that are marginalized in the curriculum, but ethnic studies started through the efforts of these 4 groups to transform education for their kids. And I would not displace these 4 groups because the concerns are very important concerns and legitimate concerns. But this is also why I try to direct people to, let's look at the whole curriculum, K-12, across the disciplines. That leaves a lot of room for being much more inclusive of a lot of folks. And really a lot of the tension that I experience gets to be when we're trying to figure out what to do with one semester course, when there's all this other space that we could be working with.
And as a follow-up to that, another question that came up several times was, can you speak to the role of anti-Semitism in multicultural education and or ethnic studies?
The role of anti-Semitism in multicultural education?
Yes.
Considering that my own experience with multicultural education, several of my colleagues are Jewish, I don't know that multicultural education is anti-Semitic. Obviously, somebody who wrote the question sees it that way. That just conflicts with my own experience. If the question is, why are Jewish people not included as one of the 4 groups with ethnic studies? I kind of go back to my, let's look at the whole curriculum, because there's lots of space for inclusion of Jewish literature, Jewish history, Jewish philosophy within the curriculum. But the 4 groups whose school experience has been, in many cases, just plain terrible. Kids who are leaving school, not graduating from school, not achieving well in school, partly because of what school offers them. That's where I want to keep the focus. And I don't, myself, I don't see that focus as anti-Semitic, because at the same time, there's the whole curriculum that we have to work with.
Thank you, Dr. Sleeder. This is more of a programmatic or implementation type of question. This came up too in several ways. But in your experience, what are the major mistakes to avoid as a district moves toward integrating ethnic studies into its programs?
I think one of the things is scaling up too much too fast. San Francisco Unified started with 5 schools doing pilot, and they spent several years actually before they scaled it up to try to make sure that they were getting it right. And in addition to that, they contracted with Stanford University to have some researchers collect data on the impact of what they were doing on students. Because they wanted to make sure that it not only just sort of felt right from the teacher's point of view, but it was actually making a demonstrable difference. And then they scaled up after that. But I think when things start out too big, then it tends to fall apart. Another thing is teacher involvement. And I know that you're planning on having teacher involvement, which I think is super, super important. Because I know that teachers who feel like something is imposed on them aren't real happy with that. And I've certainly been one of those teachers who, if somebody like tells me this is what you have to do, I don't necessarily do it or do it well. But having it come from the teachers is, I think, really important. But as I said also earlier, finding partnerships that can be formed with ethnic studies in the university or community college level can really also help with just the richness of the development of ethnic studies. Another thing I think is maintaining open lines of communication with the board, with the administration, with the public, so that people aren't surprised about how things are unfolding, which means that there may be a lot of pushback and controversy, but I think it's better to have that out in the open rather than to have something get developed and then people are like, oh my God, where'd that come from? Another thing that I think is also important is to have some student involvement. I mentioned the program in West Oakland, or in Oakland, that didn't find a positive impact on students. And it was because the people who came up with the curriculum weren't really in dialogue with the students. And when the students encountered it, they were like, that isn't us. And so having student input, I think, can help, because it really is students that you're trying to reach. And so having that student input, I think, can also be really, really helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Sleeder. You just addressed a couple of other questions I was going to ask, but I think, could you speak a little bit more to teachers? And the question is, what are your recommendations for creating buy-in by all or most teachers and administrators in a school district?
All teachers aren't necessarily going to be teaching their courses from ethnic studies perspective. So what I would want is that they are okay with the teachers doing so. Helping people to see why we're doing what we're doing, I think, is important. And this was partly why I did the framing in terms of the main three things that the ethnic studies is trying to do is improve the academic learning of students of color, make the education relevant to addressing issues in communities of color, and developing cross-group interaction. And those are things that I think most people would buy into those goals. So helping people see how teaching, how courses have units and lessons and stuff contribute towards those goals can be helpful with buy-in. And then if you collect some data about the impact on students, that can also be helpful. Now, what we saw in the case of Tucson, they had a lot of data and good data, consistent data. I've looked at the data, and the program was still attacked by politicians who viewed it as being seditious, divisive, too full of propaganda. And the work that the politicians did to try to get rid of ethnic studies ultimately was thrown out by a judge when it went to trial. So the data don't necessarily protect you, but they do help people see whether this is making a difference that people basically agree with or not.
Thank you, Dr. Sleeder.
Can I add? There's one other thing I want to add. There's sometimes a misconception about ethnic studies, is people will sometimes think of ethnic studies as the teacher bringing their thinking and imposing it on the kids and telling the kids, here's how you're supposed to think about stuff. And that's actually not how good ethnic studies teaching works. Ethnic studies teaching try to help the kids understand a point of view that may not be their point of view, But kids are encouraged to do their own critical thinking. Multiple perspectives in the classroom are actually viewed as a good thing rather than a bad thing. Having work around how do we disagree respectfully, how do we learn to listen to each other as we're disagreeing is a big part of ethnic studies pedagogy. Oftentimes people don't realize that actually multiple perspectives is sort of a part of what happens in an ethnic studies classroom.
Thank you, Dr. Sleeder. I have another programmatic one here. I'm gonna maybe add 2 questions in here. And the question is, and you did touch on this, but I'd like to hear a little bit more, and that is, should these classes, meaning ethnic studies, be included within all subjects or focused on in the social sciences? Is it more impactful to be included into all courses or a separate individual standalone course? And there's another question somewhat related around ethnic studies and whether or not it can play a role in career tech education. Any reaction?
Yeah, I'd say like both and in terms of an ethnic studies course and ethnic studies perspectives in all the other courses. And including what career tech? Yeah, that's possible. It's not my area, so I can't exactly tell you how to do it and what it looks like, although I can start kind of using my imagination to think of what it might look like. But I mean, if even math can be made culturally relevant, anything can be made culturally relevant.
Okay, let's go a little higher up in elevation towards policy. And do you have any insights on how many school districts in the US are adopting ethnic studies curricula? Are there any other states wanting to make ethnic studies a graduation requirement?
Let's see, I'm not exactly sure where we are with that. There are states that are mandating that it be part of the curriculum. Whether they're mandating it be a graduation requirement, I'm not sure. I know Oregon mandated that it be part of the curriculum. I think Indiana, Rhode Island was working on that. California is doing the most. I think the most energy, the most work is coming out of California. But the energy for ethnic studies, this is interesting, the energy for ethnic studies largely comes from students and students in communities of color. And what I find really interesting, and this is really across the board, in Oregon, for example, in Portland, where they developed an ethnic studies requirement for Portland public schools. It was the kids that did it. In Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island, it's the kids that are doing it with some help from the adults, but it's mostly coming from the kids. And what I find really interesting about that is that it's kids who want an education, but who want an education that they can relate to. And so it's kids who are getting out in the streets demanding ethnic studies because they want education. And sometimes, you know, when people think that it's being imposed from somebody else or it's going to ruin kids' education, a lot of this is coming from us, what the kids are asking for.
Thank you, Dr. Slater. And looks like this last question here that came up, I think might be a good one as we embark or re-embark on our own journey in Davis to better understand, explore, pilot, and ultimately recommend and implement a program. Let's see, are there examples or do you have any advice on how we as a community can, parents and stakeholders engage as learners rather than advocating for particular positions?
That's a really good question. Engage as learners. Something that I enjoy doing, and I've started reading that this is actually a good form of professional development. People are starting to do studies on this, is teacher study groups. There could be parent, like book groups, where you pick a book and everybody reads it, and then you come together and have a discussion about it. And it could be a book about ethnic studies, or it could be like say US history book from like a Chicano perspective, or it could, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that it could be. But book groups, study groups can be one way that people can become learners of ethnic studies. I think that's a great question. You can bring in people, and I recommended somebody to you, a couple people who could be really good for professional development. But when I think back to my own, how I got into ethnic studies, it was, a lot of it was through picking up books myself and reading. I started, I mentioned that I came from Medford, Oregon, and found myself in inner city Seattle. And I'm feeling just like totally like I was so unprepared for just, what do I do? And spent time in the community. Actually, that was very important. Spent time talking with the kids, but also then started reading ethnic studies literature. And the way I set it up, I don't necessarily say this is the way to do it, it's just what I did. And I have continued to do, is the first year, I thought, okay, let me focus on African Americans. So I started reading some African American literature, and I think an African American history book. The next year, okay, let me try Chicano literature, Chicano history. The next year, okay, let me try American Indian, and I just kept doing that. But I think organizing study groups where people are actually talking with each other about common readings is a very helpful thing to do.
Thank you, Dr. Sleeder. And I think maybe to wrap up, what words would you like to leave us with? I mean, as a community, that we're just beginning in some ways and restarting the work that we started earlier in the year. What advice would you like to leave us with?
Well, I think you're taking up something that's super, super important. I mean, I look at this country and how we struggle with our differences. Just the protests during the summer of Black Lives Matter and protests against police brutality that a lot of people understood and a lot of people didn't understand, and issues that may or may not be actually getting dealt with. But this is, I think, as a diverse country, the future of this country really depends on us being able to understand each other's histories and understand where each other's coming from and figure out how to build institutions that work better for all of us. And so I think that that's what you're embarking on, which I think is just absolutely super exciting.
Well, on behalf of all of us, staff, members of the community, we're very grateful for your time, for your wisdom, for your insights. This is so important to us, and it's very helpful and the data, of course. We love the data, but thank you for the time, and we look forward to reporting back to you our progress as we move forward. As a reminder for our community, next week on October 15th is our next board meeting. Again, that begins at 6:30 p.m. and we will be presenting our district's plan for our ethnic studies work. So all the details will be provided then, and we look forward to working with our students, our staff, and our community at large in the hard but noble work ahead of us. So with that, we'd like to end this webinar. And Dr. Sleeder, thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thanks all.